All right, so we're very excited to welcome you all to the next installment of our video series created as a part of the course A Communion of Subjects, Law, Environment, and Religion at Yale University. My name is Clara Rowe, and I'm a master's student at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies.
And I'm Seth Auster-Rosen, a master's student in the Divinity School.
And we're very pleased to have William Reilly with us today. He's a Yale graduate, former director of WWF, EPA Administrator under President George H.W. Bush, co-chair of the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling, and board member of various well-known corporations and not-for-profits. Thanks for joining us today, Bill.
Very pleased to be your guest.
Thank you. So, Bill, if we could lead off with just a question about how you got into environmentalism. Maybe a poignant childhood story or just something that you recall that comes back that...
There are two very distinct memories that I have about that more or less relate to my interest, I think. One is of a farm which my parents owned, and my dad used to say, since he had some difficulties when I was in college, that's what puts you through college, that farm. So that gave me a special attachment to it. And I used to go there from time to time and ride down the corn stalks and watch the foxes play out in the fields, which they used to do in those days. And it was full of wildlife because all of the hedgerows in the Middle West, nobody here is old enough to remember that, but there was a time when the farms were typically bounded by them, really as windbreaks, among other things. But they were full of pheasant and grouse and foxes and all sorts of wildlife. And I really was attached to that and took that as normal. And then I can remember as a little boy, I think I was 4, we had a summer vacation. My father was home from the Army in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, and I looked across a water body that you couldn't see across. I never imagined that there was a lake like that, and we went swimming in it. I remember it was too cold for me, but not for my sister, who was 4 years older. And then I saw the ocean the same year because my father had a romance about the sea and about travel. He'd worked on ships and he'd worked on trains. He was always in motion. And he very much regretted, I think, that he was spending his business career in central Illinois, so far from the ocean. And I caught from him this fascination of the sea. And we used to ride the ferry to Jamestown from Newport. And the Atlantic destroyer fleet was in there then. And my dad would point out all the ships. And we would take maybe 6 or 7 rides across. We'd just stay on. And it cost, I don't know, a nickel, 10 cents, something like that. And I think it just took. And water, I was mostly known, I think, based because we revisited the Clean Air Act and did set some precedents in that area as an air person. But actually, water was my passion. And I later, after I was in government, founded a firm that invested a little over $300 million in water in developing countries. Water, sanitation, drinking water, drip irrigation, beer, anything, water storage, anything related to water, I did. And it just has been a theme. And the reason I did it, what the real passion came from talking to environment ministers at the Rio Conference in 1992, where I headed the U.S. delegation. And several of them, at least 5, brought up one way or another the fact that we were involved in what to them were middle-class enthusiasms, in that we were concerned about ozone depletion, upper atmospheric ozone depletion, biodiversity, and climate. And several of them, without disparaging those concerns, said, no one is dying for those issues in our countries. Nigeria, Mexico, India, Malaysia, but they are for want of clean water or for want of sanitation. And that's the reason I founded the Water Fund. So that's been kind of a theme in my career. And I think it all started back there at Lake Michigan and on the farm in Cerro Gordo, Illinois.
All right, thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we wanted to take you sort of from the small to the large, and ask you if you could give us sort of a thermometer reading. If you had to say, what is the state of environmental affairs today? What have you seen change? How do you think people's actions and consciousness have changed toward the environment in your career?
It's common for environmentalists to be doomsayers. And part of that is that has been important, I think, to animating the movement, energizing it, raising the resources to support it. But I think it's wrong. If you look at the period in which I've been involved in the environment, we have made fabulous progress. There are very few priorities that we set as a country on which we've not made very substantial progress. It starts with air and water, but then it goes on to toxics and hazardous waste management and safe drinking water. The whole series of statutes that were passed in the early 70s, we have very indisputable metrics of success. We've not solved all these problems, but go to LA today, if you remember what it was like 30 years ago, it's a transformed place. The same is true of the Hudson River and the Great Lakes. The big concern about Lake Erie when I was in office was whether we were going to have any fish in Lake Erie. Now we've got a lot of fish. You can't eat them. I don't want to overdo this. But, you know, it's a good news, bad news story, but it's basically directionally correct, as I used to say when we hadn't solved a problem, but we were working on it. I've recently had occasion to spend time worrying about the oceans and policies for the marine environment. That's not a success story to the same degree. We've never set a priority for the oceans. We don't have national ocean policy. So it's no surprise in some ways. It isn't something that we devoted these same resources to. I am a big believer that anyone who's involved with the environmental movement should begin by recognizing the foundation that we built and what fabulous things the country has done with the resources we've had, which have taken a lot of attention, sacrifice, court suits, contention, but that by and large have worked.
Bill, if I could ask you, if I could sort of follow up that question and say that in preparation for your visit, we've read quite a bit of your work from the time that you were in the EPA, director of the EPA, to the time working on the BP oil spill more recently. I'm wondering, how do you see your own rhetoric and methods of advocacy having changed over time throughout your career?
Well, I read some of the stuff that you all were looking at, and Greg Easterbrook was a fan of mine, and he says my jokes fell flat. What? I've got to talk to Greg about it. Greg, by the way, is someone who has written that the environment is one of the two great success stories of post-war social policy, the other one being Social Security. I think that, what was the question?
How your methods have changed over time, say since your time in the EPA and the way you speak and think about things.
Well, I've always been reasonably confident of the directions we're going and of the kinds of things we're doing in the environment. I had the good fortune to be there when things were happening. What you really want, I've served 2 times in the government aside from my Army period, and the first was the environmental rally. I was hired in the spring of 1970, just a couple of weeks before Earth Day. And my first job was to find $500 million in projects that we would cancel of major dams around the country. And I can remember I was just out of the Army, and I called up the Corps of Engineers, and they sent a brigadier general and a couple of colonels and a light colonel to hold the pointer. And they were seeking a language I didn't understand, feet per second and acre feet and all that, and I was busily writing it down, but I was a White House, so they had to take it very seriously. And we found the money. Incidentally, as often works in public life, you find out later what the money was about. It was to find money for school desegregation and busing in the South. But we found that money, and I wrote the regulations for environmental impact assessment, which is a brand new statute then, the National Environmental Policy Act. I wrote what became the Coastal Zone Management Act. I had written it as the National Land Use Policy Act. That failed by 1 vote in the House, passed the Senate a couple of times. And all of those, clean air, clean water, toxic substances, safe drinking water, later in the decade, hazardous waste and waste management, those were charters for action, and very ambitious action, so that it was heaven to be alive in that environment of excitement and really substantial change in the way we had previously addressed environmental problems. Nature conservation. I think what happened in the late 60s was a conjunction between the community of people concerned about birds and trees, National Audubon Society, National Wildlife Federation, hunters and fishermen, with the public health community that increasingly was affected by the epidemiological evidence of pollution's effect on people and lungs, particulates in the lungs especially, and they came together and they created a very new phenomenon, a new force. And President Nixon, when he was campaigning in '68, is said to have been astounded to discover that along with the war in Vietnam and the economy, the environment was in the top 3 concerns of the American public, and that helped explain why he made it such a priority. Those days were days of much less sophistication about the issue. When I looked at non-governmental organizations, I don't believe that, except for Resources for the Future, which was not an environmentalist organization, I don't believe there was an economist in any one of the NGOs. It was a time when most of the statutes did not have the kind of scientific basis that now we would expect them to have. All of the research that went into our acid rain provision, that was a $10 million, what was it called, NAPAP, National Acid Precipitation Study, that Senator Moynihan was sponsoring and was very proud of. That all came with gradual change. And business finally, I think at some point, major companies certainly realized that the support for environmental protection, clean air and clean water particularly, was in the mid-'80s. Even through the Arab oil embargo, even through economic downturns, it was constant support. And I think the shrewder business leaders decided this is here to stay. We need to get involved in a way we didn't when we just opposed these laws and help make them work. And I think the best of our corporate citizens have done that.
I think you've hinted at a few transitions that we've talked about in class as well, one being sort of the shift from command and control towards market mechanisms, and the other being, real bipartisan support and the idea that everyone cared about the environment to increasing polarization of environmental issues. And I wonder whether you agree with that, that characteristic of shifts, but also whether you think they're related in any way when we're thinking about how people have changed in terms of the way they're dealing with environmental issues.
I was involved a few years ago, I think almost 10 years ago, in the establishment of a new institute at Duke, and we commissioned some polling. And it turned out that there were 2 perceptions that were a brake on new initiatives in the environment. One was the sense that we'd solve the problems, the principal, obvious, visible problems. And the other was that regulation cost jobs and cost money. Those perceptions are out there, and it's difficult to credit them that much because we had a budget director in the Bush administration who used to say that the Clean Air Act was going to cause a depression in the 1990s. Well, we all saw what happened to the economy in the 1990s. It's a lot cleaner, too. You cannot make that argument, I don't think, respectively. The sense that Republicans participated in all that was so important in the beginning. Senator Chafee, there are several senators from New England states particularly, played a key role with Senators Muskie and Jackson, Democrats, on collaborating in the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act particularly, the major charters. That continued into the early 80s. We had a bit of a backlash, a deregulatory backlash in the early Reagan administration, and some of you may know the history of Secretary Watt at the Interior Department and Miss Burford at the EPA. And yet, the take on their experience, which only lasted about 2 years, was that it was a big mistake to claim to roll back those fundamental commitments. So we got in a situation where, at the moment, it's difficult, I think, for the critics of environmentalism and environmental legislation and regulation to roll them back effectively, but it's relatively easy for them to prevent new initiatives or strengthening. and we're having a very difficult time on the climate issue. That's a special issue that seems to have attracted the lightning in a way that nothing really else does. And I've thought a lot about why it is that Senator McCain could run on a platform and actually have been the sponsor of McCain-Lieberman, which was a cap-and-trade bill. I was told, frankly, by the third-ranking member of the House that who is a Rhodes Scholar, has a PhD in British history, that if he were to have supported cap-and-trade, he would have been wisely advised not even to run in his primary because of concerns that evangelicals have about climate change and about carbon regulation. Well, we have those constituency issues. It's not just rich donors, the Koch brothers, who are preventing us from addressing this question. It's more fundamental than that. I am reasonably confident that at some point we're going to have a breakout, as Senator Whitehouse has put it, of a group of Republicans who will all make for the green hills of climate regulation together. Otherwise, they're going to get picked off one by one. And I think that started to happen last month when 15 Republican senators, voted in a resolution that there is global warming, climate change occurring. Humans are contributing to it. 5 of them said significantly. 10 of them didn't go that far. Apparently, the distinction is that if you said significantly, you got to support regulation, I've been told. So I'm reasonably confident that we're going to see a change, and I'm the product myself of a president who was vice president under Reagan, after all, and who made himself the environmental candidate and used the issue very effectively in the summer of 1988. It happened to be an unusual summer. It was very hot. There were ozone alerts all across the country, and there was hazardous waste, medical waste, washing up on the beaches of New Jersey and Long Island. He used that very effectively, and the country turned. I used to deal with a lot of people in the Congress, even the administration, who didn't get it, who didn't see this as an issue for Republicans. But Bush did, and exploited it very effectively and used it to give us leadership on a lot of the things that we accomplished on wetlands and air and a whole range of subjects.
Bill, I'd like to follow up on that point and ask, so you're talking about a shift from more environmental concern to less, and you attribute this to, at least in part, concerns of evangelicals in the United States and denial of climate change, but that Republicans are starting to come back to these concerns. What do you attribute that return to these concerns to? And is it that evangelicals are coming around, so these Republican senators say don't have as much to worry about, or is there a kind of split going on? What do you attribute that to?
I used to know Richard Cizik, who was the political director for the National Evangelical Association, and he would explain the concerns that evangelicals had about arrogating to humans control of the Earth's climate, something so fundamental, which was considered overstretch and untrue. And I'm not that informed about any of that, and I'm not aware of any movement on the part of evangelicals. What I would assume is happening is that whereas when I served in office, the climate issue was largely a function of modeling. We had the models and we had reports, 2 of them at least, from the National Academy of Sciences that predicted climate change. We didn't have many effects we could point to. Well, now you got effects everywhere. I mean, you've got all sorts of drought and flood and glacial melting and the Arctic melting incidents that have been predicted by the models, but now they're occurring. I mean, it's indisputable. And Miami Beach, I was just noticing that Senator Rubio has just declared for the presidency. He said some things about climate, which for a Florida senator I find very difficult. The South Florida politicians are now dealing with sea level rise, which is very disruptive. And they're having to put in all sorts of pumps, to make sure that water, when it backs up after a severe storm, is pushed back into the sea. Well, that's just one of the kind of experiences that we're going to see a lot more of in the years ahead. And I think given the relative consensus, and it's really a vast preponderance of scientific opinion, that climate change is happening and it's going to continue, nobody's oblivious to it. And I have heard one congressman tell me that there are at least 100 Republicans in the House who fully get it and understand it, but constituency pressures have kept them from going public with it. I think that will change. I think our politics is very responsive to news, to changes, to perceptions on the part of the public, to cultural transitions. We have a pretty fluid system, and largely, I think, over time, responsive system. So I suspect that will change, and that gradually evangelicals and others will agree whether or not humans are causing the change, that it is in fact occurring. I was very impressed that in 1996, Mayor Daley, no reputed tree hugger, him, in Chicago, convened the leaders of scientists from several of the great universities in Chicago, and they formulated the scientific basis for what has become the Chicago Climate Action Plan. Well, that plan assumed a certain decline in the level of Lake Michigan. It assumed temperatures in the 95 plus area for 45 days of the year. The average last century was 15. It assumed that rainfall will be much more like California's. If California continues to get any water. That is, that it falls between November and April, and then you don't see it rain again. They changed the tree species that they plant in the parks. They plant 2,200 trees a year, and no longer Illinois ash, which is the state tree, or Norway spruce, or maple. They just won't make it. They're planting Alabama gum. And they've got permeable pavement that they've invented. A whole range of things. And the interesting thing to me about this is there was no ideology. There was no attempt to blame anybody for this. It just looks like it's our future, and this is a prudent mayor and a prudent leadership, and that's what they did. Bloomberg did something very similar. You didn't hear a lot of arguments, you hear them now from him about the necessity to change our ideological outlook on climate and accept scientific opinion. But mostly he changed the fuels that were in use and the insulation standards and a whole range of other things. He said, incidentally, something that I quite love. His planning advisor reported in his book that Mayor Bloomberg looked at the city of New York and he saw 6 boroughs, the 5 boroughs we know, and the waterfront, and proceeded to invest in it and make the most of its recreational advantages. Anyway, I think it's possible to address these issues and adapt to them prudently, to begin to accommodate what appears to be an inevitable future, and to do so without spending a lot of time casting blame on humanity, if that's politically expedient.
I wonder if you're surprised by how long it's taken for this action to come, and especially thinking about action on the international level with the COP coming up in Paris. I wonder what you think is at stake in terms of that international agreement. Is that critical to having a climate solution, or is the city-by-city basis, as we're starting to see in the U.S., is that working?
Question. It's a good question. The interesting thing to me when I first saw the terms of the COP in Paris are that they've set the bar pretty low. They really, if you understand it, have said each of the countries present what it is you're going to do, and we're going to bless you. We're going to say bravo. I was discouraged by that, and yet I began to think about, have served on the board of the Packard Foundation, which has provided $500 billion over 5 years and just recently renewed their support for climate work in China and other places. Hewlett Foundation, same thing, matched it. And I remember when Waxman-Markey went down to defeat the climate bill in the United States in the Congress, and we had no progress made seriously at Copenhagen. The reaction among Packard women, the members of the family on the board, is, well, there's so many good things we can do with our resources. We had the impression that this was going to be a winning ticket and we were going to make some progress. It doesn't appear that we are. And I think that kind of sense of failure began to permeate the conversations about climate. And there was a sense for a while that, well, we weren't going to get anywhere with this, and maybe it wasn't worth the candle in terms of certainly philanthropy. There's so many things that you can do that you have prospect of winning on. with that in mind, I've sort of thought that maybe it makes sense. Maybe it makes sense if we get reasonably good commitments from the United States, and we do. What's happening on 111D, as it's called, the carbon regulation for existing power plants, is terrific. EPA is carrying an awfully big load, and the Clean Air Act, I can tell you, was not designed to bear it. Nevertheless, it's what we have, and it happens to be working. And if you take that, that's 40% of the carbon dioxide that comes from power plants, electrical generating facilities, and then you add to it the 54.5 mile per gallon automobile fuel efficiency standard that was worked out with the auto industry by the administration. That alone, by the way, the latter, is going to be responsible for a reduction of about 2 million, a little more than 2 million barrels of oil a day in the United States. It's fabulous. It's terrific progress. So for those, especially in the rest of the world, who look at the United States and think we're doing nothing, well, the Congress manages to convince everybody of that, and they're quite effective at it. But in truth, those two items, if we can maintain both of them, and obviously this is going to depend on the next president, because we're not going to complete carbon regulation in this president's term. It will have to be, it hasn't even come out yet, but it will have to be litigated, and it'll take a long time to litigate it, and finally to get something happening that makes a difference to the climate. But we're on the right track. It's directionally correct.
Can I jump in with one more question?
Sure, of course.
So thinking about solutions, I'm wondering what we can learn from the Montreal Protocol, which is touted as this very successful international protocol to address ozone. And in that case, we saw big companies like DuPont actually playing a really important role in making that happen, partly because they could benefit from this substitute for CFCs. And I wonder whether you see a similar role in that solution making for companies, especially those involved in fossil fuel production, when we think about climate change, or whether that is kind of a fundamentally different issue than ozone, and there's not that same role to be played.
Climate is a much more complicated issue than upper atmospheric ozone depletion. It wasn't so simple for DuPont either. DuPont gave up an $800 million revenue item in CFCs, which they had invented. If you know these people, I served on the DuPont board as chairman of the environmental policy. It was their baby. It's their children, these things. It's like nylon and Kevlar and all the rest of them. It wasn't so easy, but they did decide that they were implicated, and they made a constructive and public regarding mood. They then did something else that turned out to be very important. I remember going to Mrs. Thatcher's conference on upper atmospheric ozone. She was a chemist at Cambridge, by the way. She understood the issues. And I walked over to the minister from China, and I said, "Do you dispute the science?" We had just shown NASA's ozone hole video. And he said, "Well, we find it awfully convenient that these products that are so useful to us now and that you have substitutes for are to be banned." No, he said, "We'll have to find out whether the National Academy of Sciences of China supports this interpretation." But at that time, there were some 300 million new refrigerators planned to be built over the next 10 years in China. 300 million. They were all going to contain CFCs. And I asked DuPont to send people to explain to them that the substitutes could cost no more than $1 per refrigerator. And they did, and that was effective. But it would have blown us all away. It really did show you how a problem like that, if it's not addressed internationally, you're not going to get anywhere. The climate issue is more complicated. It's complicated by a number of things, one of which is that fossil fuels are so useful. I mean, what else will drive, a gallon will drive a 2.5-ton car 20 miles. I mean, it's just hard to come up with anything as efficient. But we are going to get there, I think, and the natural gas revolution is getting us there. I mean, when you talk about corporations, it's useful to look at the commitments that President Obama made to get a 17% reduction by 2020 in our greenhouse gases. We're about halfway there. We're there because of the oil and gas industry, because they figured out how to get gas, but more important, the liquids co-located with them, cheaply and plentifully to use. That tells you something, I think, very important, and it's relevant to the divestiture movement. Be careful. Be careful not to reduce the capital expenditures or capabilities of these companies. It's very likely. I served on the board of one, and I remember they got very excited about something called General Compression, a Boston company that was working in Texas to try to compress, basically to store power, to store energy. And they have the resources to expend. And when the time comes, I think they will probably be important to the solutions, just as they're now a major part of the problem in terms of getting the conversion. I've been very impressed at how fast renewables have come on. Some years ago, I paid $8.50 per kilowatt for solar panels at a place that I have in Sonoma County, California. And this year put on 12 more for $4. That's 6 or 8 years. Cut it in half. That's where things are going. And I think that's going to make it more straightforward over time. People are making money on renewables. I've just watched a company in Texas make a commitment for 220 megawatts of solar power, utility-grade solar. Now, that hasn't been happening before. It's happened in a few places. But utility-grade solar will transform, especially in conjunction with carbon regulation, the whole situation vis-a-vis CO2. I'm reasonably confident that's going to happen. The oil price is not helpful there.
Yeah.
$50 oil price is going to make it more difficult. Natural gas is so cheap that finally making the conversion out of natural gas might be problematic, and more so than we would like. On the other hand, let's keep our eye on the ball. Natural gas is displacing coal. That is very much to be desired. That is a good consequence for public policy. We'll face the next problem of converting from gas when it's time. But meanwhile, let's move coal out of the system.
Bill, I read recently that, natural gas is certainly a cleaner fossil fuel than some others. The way that it's extracted through fracking is it releases so much methane, it contaminates so much water, it makes so much, it kills the water, as is said. There are so many problems with the way that it's done, which are it seems have been difficult to avoid because it's a spreading method. I wanted to bring that up, but then also with the mention of China, I also read recently that roughly half of the pollution that China creates is is industry to export things to the Western world. So it's almost as though we have exported our pollution, but continued the same consumption patterns. And so I think that does speak to the complexity of the climate change issue, which you've pointed out. But it's hard for me to see in that way that progress is really being made.
Well, it's true. It's true that our consumption is powering a lot of the Chinese contamination, and they are quick to tell you that, if you meet with them, which I do regularly, that basically we cause the large accumulation of upper atmospheric CO2 and methane, and our consumption is now being underwritten by them to tremendous economic advantage on their part, but nevertheless, we have exported it. The only thing I would say about that is that China has just had a year in which they have not increased their coal consumption. That's a first. At the same time as they had a 7% GDP increase. This is really directionally correct. This is a big deal. And then the world, of course, has just experienced a year in which greenhouse gases didn't increase. On the fracking issue, we have been fracking for quite some time, natural gas wells. What's really novel about the current system is the directional, multi-directional way that we can pull up these resources. My impression is that the major problems with contamination of surface water, certainly, has occurred as a consequence of people who had very little experience with the technology. Certainly the major oil companies consider that what happened in Pennsylvania was shocking and inexcusable, where the casements were breaking. Casements don't break. I mean, that's just not, it doesn't happen if you've got a reasonably efficient operator, and most of the big companies know how to do it. As for the methane releases, those look like they're anywhere from less than 1 to 4%. And one of the marvelous things that happened, as I was asked earlier today about the future of NGOs and whether there's a career there. Well, it's a major NGO, Environmental Defense Fund, that set out to develop the appropriate regulations to, first of all, get a fix on how big the problem is, and then to come up with the appropriate regulatory approach that will limit the methane releases, which ought not to be that hard because it's product, after all. It's money. It's the commodity. So I think that's a completely manageable problem. And as far as the water contamination is concerned, that is not happening in most of the states with the experience that of oil and gas, Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska. What is happening is the industrialization of a lot of previously bucolic and undeveloped areas. That is a consequence of the technology. It's the industrialization of parts of the countryside. And no doubt that there are going to be winners and losers in such a system. But I wouldn't lose sight of the fact that for the country as a whole, it's really changed our energy economy. It's given us the capacity to move beyond coal-fired power and move to gas right away, and that's happening. Something like a third of coal-fired power has already been affected. That's profoundly to be desired. The same advantages have occurred to a whole range of industries. Thinks of chemicals or aluminum. They are in a much better competitive situation as a consequence of the cheap gas. So it's doing good things for the economy. By and large, it's doing good things for the environment, and it's giving us the possibility of displacing coal.
So I imagine that we could keep going industry by industry and have a really productive conversation about this, but I wonder if, in the interest of time, we can step back for a moment and think about kind of the larger systems driving this. And one of the things that comes up a lot in forestry school classes, and I know in other places as well, is sort of an ongoing and perhaps growing debate over whether capitalism can successfully address environmental problems. And I think, authors like Naomi Klein and Gus Beth argue that capitalism is sort of a fundamentally misaligned with environmental goals. And, based on my reading of your work, I think you show that market mechanisms can work in some instances, and I wonder if you think, or if you can tell us a bit more about how you think they work, and whether there are places when they don't work.
Well, I've always been fascinated by the fact that the materiality of value has been decreasing. That is, that it's taken. We're getting a lot more high value, low material product as civilization develops and evolves. We're growing so fast that it's discounting that effect, but that is what's been happening, and that's certainly to be desired. I think capitalism will work toward more efficient use of resources and commodities, but whether it will do it fast enough to accommodate the growth, I really don't know. With respect to the pollution rights trading and things of that sort, there's no doubt that it proved a vastly more efficient approach to reducing sulfur dioxides than any other choice we might have made. And I look back, and my own agency predicted that it would cost between $600 and $800 a ton to get sulfur dioxides out of the utility emissions. The electric utility industry, which should know more about it than we did, it estimated $1,300 to $1,500 a ton. Well, it came in well under $200. It was much, much more efficient than we anticipated. And I think there are analogies in other areas. I don't think you can get there, though, simply that way when you finally are going to have to get a 50 or even an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases. I think we're going to need very specific regulations that impel a transition to non-fossil fuels. And I think in a lot of places that's going to be difficult. I think to the extent that we target resource development, which to some extent this administration has tried to do in the energy area to promote renewables, alternatives, so that you really have the alternatives. I think that's very important. It's pretty clear that most people, most economies will not easily give up the conveniences associated with high fossil fuel development. And that's going to need serious regulation. Whether that's capitalistic, I think within a capitalistic environment of trying to generally accommodate consumer demands, in a more benign way with less impact on the environment. I think all of that is potentially possible, but I suspect it's going to take strong regulation to get there.
So you imagine governance structures as a very important way to overlay
Yes.
on the system.
Yes. Someone had to say finally, CFCs are just not permissible any longer.
Yep.
And even recognizing that they were so useful, and they were particularly useful in the developing world. They had a harder time with the replacement. They got resources. Developed world stepped forward and provided those funds. But that was not an easy transition, and this one is likely to be a more complex one.
Yeah. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, Bill, I noticed that you attribute, or you make the statement that it's difficult to make people change their habits, that if you're in the habit of high consumption, that's going to be, and which depends upon fossil fuel use, it's going to be difficult to rehabituate out of that, which I'm sure is true. But I wonder if this is more an issue of the habits of consumption, or if they have to do with the markets that really thrive on that consumption and encourage it. I'm thinking last Monday, ExxonMobil issued 2 reports, right, which were a response to shareholders about a resolution that demanded that they disclose their carbon risk and talk about how they plan to deal with the fact that they and other oil giants may have many times more carbon in their collective reserves than scientists say we can safely burn. From one of these reports, I quote, "Based on this analysis," says ExxonMobil, "we are confident that none of our hydrocarbon reserves are now or will become stranded." So what can the environmental world do with this perspective coming from these sort of corporate giants who thrive on fossil fuel extraction and consumption?
Some of you may remember Sheikh Yamani, who was the Minister of Oil of Saudi Arabia, who was famously quoted as saying the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. The oil industry, the oil age won't end because we run out of oil. I mean, there will be stranded assets. I see no alternative to it unless we figure out a way to capture the carbon and sequester it, which thus far we have not found an economical way to do at scale. If that does not happen, but some of these companies will have a tremendous impetus and interest in making it happen, but if it does not happen, I see no alternative to stranding those assets, and would not consider it in terms of economic history unprecedented if it turns out that we've got many more benign possibilities that have come on as competitors. I had a tour around the Tesla plant from Elon Musk not too long ago. Any of you seen that car? I'd love to have one. Really beautiful car. We're going to see those come on. I don't think we're going to see it come on as fast as we might have. This is another area where low-price gasoline, consequence of the oil price now, will possibly delay the introduction. But I think the future is pretty good for such things, for electric vehicles. One has to hope that the power plants that are, after all, providing the electricity are themselves not coal-fired power. Many of them still are. But I'm reasonably confident that that ExxonMobil is wrong about that. The transitions, they're very sophisticated. That the ExxonMobil study, particularly, as it comes out every year, and in my own firm, in a private equity firm, TPG in San Francisco, we've looked closely at their scenarios versus the scenario of our alternative energy fund, and it's difficult to dispute them and their projections in the near term. But as you get farther out, and as the science is more compelling, and as the politics begins to reflect not just the science, but the real impact of climate change on people, I think you're going to see a transformation.
And sorry, just last little follow-up on that. Are you saying that we're going to see a transformation coming from the habit side of the consumer, or is that going to be more on regulation?
I think it will be a mixture, but I think that the coincidence of increasing public concern, individual ethical concern, together with the alternatives that are less destructive in the environment, that are more benign, non-fossil fuel alternatives, will change the culture.
So we've kept things sort of to the political economic realm, I think, not quite intentionally. But this is a class where we're trying to examine sort of the intersection of religion, law, and environment. And so I'm curious about, especially in a democracy, the ways in which we try to listen to people's contradicting values at times, and when those values may or may not align with environmental goals, how we integrate those in a way that moves towards a future that seems like the environmentally sustainable future. So, I guess it's really a question about the balance of sort of process and the democratic process and the end goal of an environmentally sustainable future.
My sense is that the religious community has had very little impact on our thinking about something like climate. I look back on my own history, and shortly after I became EPA Administrator, I was invited to a meeting of several cardinals that President Bush was having. I remember he greeted my wife and me at the elevator, and he said, "Be quick to put out your hand. They kind of all look alike to me." And I got inside, and Cardinal Law, who was a very formidable figure, the Archbishop of Boston, discovered who I was, and he lit into me about my asbestos rules. And I started to say to him, "Well, we don't regulate asbestos." He said, no, you don't do that. You just require that we do an audit." Well, he said, "We find there's asbestos in the school. Let me tell you what happens. The parents say, 'No way, I want my children in that school.' The bishop goes to the banker. The banker says, 'Love to lend money to you, Bishop, but we never lend money on asbestos-containing building.'" Well, anyway, I heard that. I was a little stung. I hadn't been lobbied before. I was brand new at EPA. And then I thought, well, actually, I've got some things I'd like to get off my chest. So I went over to the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, Cardinal Bernard, and I said, "You've been associated with marvelous pastoral statements on nuclear war, on poverty. Never said one word about the environment. And I've been going to Mass for 40 years. I've never heard it once mentioned from the pulpit." He said, "Interesting." He said, "I've kept environment out of our pastorals, thinking we might want to do that someday. Do you have an idea of what we should say?" I said, "Yes, I do." And I said, "Look at what the bishops in Germany, Mexico, Philippines have said." Well, a few weeks went by, maybe more than that. I got invited to speak to the Social Welfare Committee of the bishops, and I popped off on my views. And it seems so self-evident that a theology of incarnation includes nature. And certainly the Catholic tradition, which is a very sacramental tradition, looks at so much as sacred, with plenty of biblical support for that outlook, should have resulted in a joining together of environmental concern and sympathy that it hasn't. And at any rate, some time went by and I didn't see anything from them, so I asked to see the Pope. And word came back, well, the Pope doesn't see ministers. A few weeks later, I got an invitation to see the Holy Father, and was told that someone in the hierarchy had said, "This is not an ordinary minister." So I went off and I was going to tell the Pope what to do. Well, I was going to tell him to order the American bishops to issue a pastoral. And I was told by Monsignor Diarmuid Martin, who's now Archbishop of Dublin, it doesn't work that way. He would never do it. I said, "Well, I'm going to tell him that he should have a statement." He said, "Well, that you can do." At any rate, we then talked about it. And yet I still, to this day, the bishops of the United States issued a very good statement, a superb statement on this. And in a very modest way, saying that they were admittedly engaging the issue largely for the first time. I mean, given that the two great saints of the Western conservation tradition, Benedict and Francis, are both Christian saints and revered for their sanctity, how come this didn't translate into an ethic that's a little more obviously compelling and better communicated than it is? But it isn't. And I think that's generally true, that the religious community has not integrated their thinking about the sanctity of the earth and what it theologically means to protect it or to despoil it with their conventional ethical concerns and obligations.
Bill, I'd like to ask you one last question on that point, actually, before we wrap up, which is that in the Bible we have say in Genesis 1, the dominion model of, mankind and nature. Genesis 2, more of a stewardship model. And a third model gaining prominence, and largely due to thinkers like Thomas Berry, from whom our class's title, A Communion of Subjects, comes, sees mankind as primarily part of nature. Assuming that you don't prescribe as much to the dominion model, I assume, that could be wrong, do you see humans more as stewards of the environment or as parts of it?
Wow. I think you've gone beyond me here. It's very hard for me to say that I wouldn't accept either one. I think the reality that is unique to our century is we have a dominion over nature, the like of which humankind never had before. My understanding from friends in the evangelical world is that it is the sense that humans might be arrogating to themselves the management, the control, the dominion over nature and climate that is unacceptable, is blasphemous. And yet, practically speaking, from all of the objective evidence that we do have that kind of control. And you can't manage a wilderness area in the United States without worrying about invasive species, or really worrying about sanitons in various parts of the heavily visited water areas. So, and that's kind of a trivial example, but wilderness is supposed to be a place where we venture as guests and leave no trace. We've already left a trace. We've left it everywhere. I mean, the oceans are full of plastic in the Sargasso Sea. So there's a lot that we have to clean up on, but we are responsible for the earth, and I think that the concept of stewardship is a very biblical one. It is the way I am told by evangelicals one should talk about nature and nature conservation and protection. I was cautioned by Cizik years ago, don't start talking about science. That's all those Darwin guys. We don't like them. Well, okay. Language is important. As far as being part of nature, I mean, of course, in the natural system of things, we're part of nature. I mean, that's indisputable. The more we've known about DNA and the origins of the species and the and all that we share with nature, with other beings, sentient beings, really, some of them seeming more and more, I don't think you can dispute that. So I guess I'd like to have that one both ways.
Okay. All right.
Well, very political, right?
Yes. Former EPA Director Bill Reilly, thank you so much for joining us today for this seminar, and thank you all for joining us as well.
Thank you. Thank you.